Okay, do we need new drugs? And I think we do. Although we've got great drugs, many of you were the victims of us learning how to treat HIV. And many people in the past got one drug by itself or two drugs in combination and one drug after the other and have viruses that have become resistant to many of the treatments that we use. So there are some new drugs in development. And both of these drugs are being studied in Toronto. So many different sites in Toronto are looking at these drugs. So if you're in a situation where your virus is not under control, come talk to us. So the first set of drugs is these drugs called maturation inhibitors. And basically what happens is your virus gets inside your cells. It makes friends, which then leave the cell. And this drug basically prevents them from growing up and they can't leave the cell. That's basically how these things work. So there were some in the past, this drug called Efavirenz that they tried to study, but it didn't work because a third of people were resistant to it before they even saw the drug, so it was no good. So they've come up with this new one now, and they started off looking at different doses of the drug, and this is how much they worked on the virus. So they work on the virus very well. And so we've got studies going on now of this drug for people who've kind of run out of options and need a new drug to get their virus back under control. The other one that they're working at is something called an attachment inhibitor. So this prevents the virus from getting in the first place. Now, we haven't had a lot of success in developing drugs in this way either. The one we did have was T20. Some of you might remember that one. That was a horrible one. That was one that people had to inject underneath their belly twice a day, and they used to get all these hard little nodules underneath the skin. That didn't work very well. So now they have a pill, and again, it's only letters at the moment. This is a study in which they compared it to atazanavir, and they're mixing it together with raltegravir and tenofovir, and also it's working very well. So again, these are studies that are ongoing here in Toronto and in other parts of the world to see how well these drugs are going to work for people who've basically run out of options. And why they're studying them in those populations is because there's so many good things for people who are starting drugs. This is really where we need to develop new drugs, is in people who don't have as many options. And this is just showing how well it works in terms of bringing the virus under control. So the other thing that research is doing is trying to think about new ways to treat HIV. And so in the past, what we've always used is two drugs in this family called NRTIs. So that would be AZT, 3TC, abacavir, tenofovir. So most of you are probably on either Kyvexa or Truvada. So those are your sort of the backbone. And in general, we used to mix it with a protease inhibitor, or we'd mix it with the Efavirenz, or now we have mixed it with the Integrase inhibitors. But people are saying, because our drugs are so much better now, do you need three? So the first thing that they did is they looked at protease inhibitors by themselves. So they got people's virus under control, and then they just left them either on Kaletra by itself or on Persista by itself. And for the vast majority of people, that works. So once it's under control, just that, without the backbone. So that works for not a lot of people. It's not quite as good as all three, but it's pretty close. And so we do that sometimes for people who can't take the other drugs or can't manage the number of pills to kind of keep it under control. So then what they tried to do is say, well, these are the drugs that have been a bit toxic. So what if we mix a protease inhibitor and an integrase inhibitor? That seemed to make some sense. We got two real strong drugs. But it's funny, that didn't work that well. And it didn't work that well in people with really, really high viral loads and low T counts. And so now people are looking at other things. So this was called Gardel. And this was a study that was originated in Argentina. We tried to be part of it, but our ethics committee was too slow. And basically what they did is they took people and they randomized, everybody got Kaletra as the protease inhibitor, and then some people only got 3TC as their backbone, because 3TC is a pretty benign drug, and most people can take 3TC without any problems. And the other group got the standard 3TC plus AZT or 3TC plus abacavir, got standard therapy. And to everyone's surprise, the 2 did as well as the 3. And the 2 did as well even in those people with really, really high viral loads. And all the skeptics were really surprised at this. So this was important because 2 instead of 3 is going to be less toxicity, right? You only got 2 instead of 3. It's going to be less expensive. You only got 2 instead of 3. And so this may be a way to manage people. So then people said, well, if it worked with Kaletra, will it work with atazanavir? And so again, the deal was people had to have their virus under control, and then they got atazanavir with 2 other drugs, or atazanavir with only 1 other drug, and it worked. So then they say, well, what about now dolutegravir? We got an integrase, and they're working real well. What about dolutegravir and 3TC, only 2 drugs? And so this is what we call a pilot study. Whenever we're going on new territory, we do it in a small group of people first before we expose a lot of people to an unknown therapy. And these are the 20 people who volunteered for this study. And yellow is when they went undetectable. If you can read this, day 4, day 7, day 10, week 2, everybody was undetectable by 8 weeks in this study. So now they're going to do more research on this in larger number of people to see if this will work. And again, if you get rid of the extra drug, there's less risk of toxicity and obviously lower costs for the world. So that's where people are going. It looks like 2 drugs with today's drugs might be enough when you first start on treatment. That may not be so if you've been on treatment in the past and have some degree of resistance. And that was a word of caution from another group who tried this in people who had been on other treatments in the past and had developed some resistance in the past. And in their hands, 2 out of 10 people failed on the 2 drugs alone because it wasn't strong enough to keep their virus under control. So that's the message again. If you're going to go to these simpler therapies, you and your doctor need to go back over everything that you've been treated with in the past to make sure that there wasn't any resistance there. What else are people looking at? So this was something called the March study that we, again, participated in. And this now was looking at a drug called Maraviroc. And Maraviroc is something that we call a CCR5 inhibitor. And again, it's a drug that prevents the virus from getting inside the cell. Maraviroc is a good drug. It's very well tolerated. But the downside is you have to take it twice a day. And the downside is it doesn't work for everyone. And it kind of works like a lock and a key. And you have to check your virus first to see if your virus has the right lock. And if the virus doesn't have the right lock, then this drug doesn't work. And to do that test, it can only be done in San Francisco. It has to have live virus, and it costs $1,000. So you can imagine we don't use that one too much. But the idea is, because it has less toxicity, would it be something good to combine with a protease inhibitor or other drugs to try and cut down on the toxicity? But unfortunately, it didn't work. And so the standard therapy, which would be 2 reverse transcriptase inhibitors and a third drug, worked better than the Maraviroc and some other drug. So it didn't work as well. So unfortunately, that's not going to be a strategy that we're going to be able to use for people. What basically has happened is the guidelines have really changed in terms of what you should start. And what the guidelines now say is that people should start on integrase inhibitors. And we have 3 integrase inhibitors in Canada. One is called raltegravir. Now I'm going to have to remember the other names. Icentrus, okay. One of them is called dolutegravir, and it's also called Tivicay. And the third one is called elvitegravir, and it doesn't have another name yet because it isn't that way yet. And so the DHHS guidelines basically say if you're going to start treatment now, you should start treatment with an integrase inhibitor. And what the integrase inhibitors do is they prevent the HIV virus from integrating or inserting itself into the genes of our T cells. And that's what HIV does, and that's why we can't ever get rid of HIV, because every time our T cells multiply, the HIV multiplies as well because it's stuck inside our genes. The reason the panels have gone with these is because they work, they're easier to take, and they have less toxicity than some of the older drugs. So that's what the DHHS has done, and these are the European guidelines, and they've done the same thing. They basically have said most people should start on an integrase inhibitor. Both sets of guidelines have left a couple of other drugs on the list. So the European guidelines have left this drug, rilpivirine. Some of you may know it as Complera. And they've also left one of the protease inhibitors called darunavir on the list. But most people, when they start now, start on an integrase. So why? So for the last decade, Efavirenz has been the golden egg. It has been the go-to drug, Sestiva or Efavirenz, and many of you may have taken it in the form of a tripla. Why was it the gold standard? Because it worked. It worked at high viral loads, it worked at low viral loads, it worked in men, it worked in women, it worked at any T count, and nothing ever beat it. So it outperformed everything else in terms of its effect. But now, the integrase inhibitors have beat it, not because they're any better, but because they're better tolerated. And for those of you who have taken Efavirenz over the years, you may know that that's the one that makes your head a little bit weird, makes you feel up, makes you feel down, gives you good dreams, gives you bad dreams, makes you feel a bit weird. And so all of the integrase inhibitors now perform just as well or better than Efavirenz, but without all the buzzy head stuff. And so now, why would you go and have the buzzy head stuff if you don't have to, if you can have a drug that doesn't make you do that? The other thing that really pushed the panel, however, in terms of taking Efavirenz off the list, is that we know for many people it can make you feel down, can make you feel a bit depressed, can interfere with your sleep. And the doctors from the United States took all of their clinical trials, and they found out that people who were on Efavirenz were more likely to think about or commit suicide than people who didn't take Efavirenz. Now, the total number of people that commit suicide was small, but it was higher in people on Efavirenz than not. And when they tried to investigate this a little bit further, it turns out that different people have different enzymes in their body that deal with medications. And some people don't deal with Efavirenz very well, and the drug levels get very, very high in those individuals. And those are the people who went on to have problems with depression and problems with suicide. So that's not to say if you're on Efavirenz that you should go to your doctor tomorrow and say, I can't be on this drug anymore. But many doctors are switching their patients off Efavirenz if they do have any of these side effects that are interfering with their thinking or their sleeping. And many people are being switched to an integrase inhibitor, provided that they don't have resistance and that their viral load is under control. The other drugs that we used to use up front were the protease inhibitors. And so the United States, again, did this great big trial where they looked at darunavir, which is Prozista, which some of you might be on, atazanavir or Riataz, and they compared it to raltegravir, the integrase inhibitor. And again, the bottom line is they all did well in terms of inhibiting the virus and keeping the virus under control, but the raltegravir drug, the integrase drug, was again better tolerated than either of the two boosted protease inhibitors. So more evidence to suggest that this is a better group of drugs. And so now all three of these drugs have been compared against our old gold standards. They've been compared against Efavirenz. They've been compared against the boosted protease inhibitors, and they're all much better tolerated. So those are the reasons why the guidelines have now suggested that these should be the drugs we think about first when starting someone on HIV treatment. And this is how well they're tolerated. These are all the silly names that we have for all the trials. And this is how many people had to stop the integrase inhibitor because of side effects. Only 1 or 2%. And that is really, really low compared to all of the treatments that we used in the past. So we got a drug that works really well. We've got a drug that doesn't have any side effects. And then data suggesting that you should start as soon as you have been diagnosed with HIV. So clearly, if you're going to start as soon as you're diagnosed with HIV, you want something that you're going to tolerate well. And then the good news for women. I've been screaming for years that they never do any studies in women. They do all these studies in men, and we never know whether or not we should apply the results to women. So finally, they did this study called the WAVE, women, and it's one of those acronyms, right? So what they did is they looked at the single tablet regimen called Stribild. Some of you might be on Stribild, which contains the integrase inhibitor that's called elvitegravir, and they compared it to atazanavir, the protease inhibitor. So this study happened primarily in Russia, in Uganda, and in the United States. This time they didn't even ask Canada to be part of it. And the bottom line is it did just as well in terms of keeping the virus under control with less side effects. So now we've got a study showing that integrase inhibitors are working really well in women as well as in men. And emergent resistance didn't happen, and the big difference in side effects was with the atazanavir. Many of the ladies got the jaundice or the yellow color of their eyes, which we commonly associate with atazanavir. And now there's another study for women. This time Canada did get to play. So this is now looking at the other integrase inhibitor called dolutegravir, together with abacavir and 3-TC. Some of you might know it as Triumec. That's a tablet that we've had this year. And again, comparing it to boosted atazanavir. That study is fully recruited, and we expect to hear the results at our big conference in Boston in February, but we don't have the answers to this yet. But the good news is we're finally getting some studies for women. Some of the new stuff that's coming. So some of you are probably taking a drug called tenofovir. So you might be taking tenofovir by itself. You might be taking a drug called Truvada, because it's inside that. You might be taking a drug called Stribild, and it's inside that. So it sneaks away. It's in many things. The problem with tenofovir is tenofovir can hurt the kidneys and it can hurt the bones. And the two things may be linked. Now, it doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And it might happen the longer you're on the drug. And of course, me and you are all getting older. And as we get older, our kidneys don't work as well. And for women, as we get older, our bones don't work as well. And so there is some concern that if people are on this tenofovir drug for 2 decades, that maybe we're going to see more problems with the kidneys and the bones. So they've come up with a new formulation of the drug, which is, we call it TAF because nobody can say this word. And so what basically happens is you swallow the TAF, and then in your gut, the body converts it to tenofovir, which goes inside of the cells, and it works inside of the cells. So it doesn't get in the blood. And the idea is if it's not in the blood, then maybe it's not going to hurt the kidneys and not going to hurt the bones. So a lot of research has been done with this new drug, TAF, to say, should we be on TAF instead of on regular tenofovir? So first of all, you got to make sure it's going to work, right? So some concern, if it's only in your cells, is it going to work as well against the HIV? So that's got to be the first step, right? So the study was people who got, oh God, we really do use these letters, right? So this is Stribild. So how this is elvitegravir with cobicistat and FTC and this TAF drug all in one tablet. So we call it Stribild TAF versus the regular Stribild, which has tenofovir in it. So again, a randomized trial, half the people got that and half the people got that. Bottom line is it worked. Okay, it worked just as well as the old form of tenofovir with 90% of people suppressing their viral load. The other thing was you didn't get resistant to it any faster, and you didn't have any new unexpected side effects. So whenever you use something new, right, the carrier may be different or they might be something about the drug. So it worked as good, no new surprises, resistance didn't happen any more regular, so it looks like it works just fine. So the only reason now that we would want to switch to this one is if it's safer. So what they did is they looked at the kidneys, and how we measure kidneys is this thing called a GFR, how well your kidneys filter. So the red is the regular tenofovir and the blue is the TAF thing, and this is what happened to the kidney function, is it goes down a little bit when you start on drugs and then it stabilizes. But there was this difference between the TAF thing and the regular tenofovir. So it looks like the TAF thing, at least in the short term, so this was 48 weeks, was safer on the kidneys than the old one. And then they looked at the bones. So what they did is they looked at the spine and they looked at the hips. And again, this is when you start HIV drugs, your bones get a little bit weaker initially. And the red is the people on the regular tenofovir, and the blue is the people on the TAF. So again, there was this difference. So in the short term, it looks like there was less impact on the bones with the new form than the old form. But everything has other side, right? And so unfortunately, what happened was the cholesterol, or your lipids, got worse with the new form. So the new one, better for the kidneys, better for the bones, worse for the cholesterol. So here we are. Do we use the new one or not? So what's happened now is this Stribald TAF thing has now been licensed in Canada. It got its license last week. I think it was last week. It's called Genvoya. It's more expensive, as you would expect. So there's a balance for your doctor. You know, if you're on the old form of tenofovir, at the moment it's only available as Stribald. So if you're on the Stribald, should you switch to the new one? And that's a balance. Where's your cholesterol? What's your risk of heart disease versus where's your kidneys? What's your risk of bone disease? They're also going to make the TAF thing as a separate pill. So people who get regular tenofovir, not in the Stribald capsule, that will be another opportunity that we're going to have a look at. And so the question is if you've got a problem with your kidneys or your bones, does it make some sense to go to the new one? So here's people who have a little bit of kidney problem, and they switched. And you can see it's a little wee bit better, but not a whole lot better. And these are some what we call biomarkers of the kidneys, some enzymes of the kidneys. They seem to get a little bit better as well. Then they looked at whether you're losing protein in the urine. And you can see that most people who made the switch had less protein in their urine. And then they looked at what happened to the bones, and you can see that they gained back a little bit of bone strength. So all of these things are kind of looking good, that this may be helpful for people who have a bit of kidney problems or bone problems on the old formulation. The big problem with these studies is that they're very short. They're only for a year. And these differences, although these graphs look great, okay, are really kind of small, 1% difference in your bone. And whether or not that's going to make a big picture difference in terms of your bone health over a decade or 2 decades, we just don't know at this time. And then it has to be balanced against what happens to the cholesterol. So we're going to need to learn a little bit more about this drug and whether or not it's something that we're going to routinely switch. My gut sense is we're not going to have a choice, because my sense is the company is probably going to stop making the old one and we'll only have the new one and we won't have any choices. Okay, switching to other things. So this is the drug called Triumec. So Triumec is the dolutegravir integrase inhibitor with abacavir and 3-TC. That's a single tablet pill. And so what this study, Striving, was taking people who were fine on whatever they were taking and then randomizing them to either go to the Triumec or stay on what they were on and go on the Triumec later. So, if you're fine, why would you want to switch? So most of the people who went in this study were fine, and the reason they wanted to switch is they wanted one pill. And that's a lot of people who want to do that if it's safe to do so. Other reasons why you might switch is because you had a side effect, or another reason you might switch is that you're worried about some of the side effects that might happen in the future. So basically what happened was the Triumec worked just as well as what people were on. And hardly anybody failed. Everybody did well. But there were 10 people who switched and stopped the study. And why did they stop the study? For all kinds of reasons. Upset stomach, couldn't sleep, crampy stomach, itchy skin, all these kinds of things. So I think, but the other thing that they said is, yeah, but we like this one pill. So the take-home message from this study is, if you're thinking about a switch, always think about why. Okay, and there's many doctors that say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because things can go wrong. But if it is broke, or if there's a concern about side effects for the future, or you're just getting tired of taking so many pills and getting down to one a day would be helpful, or you're worried because everyone in your family died of heart disease and you're worried about heart disease in the future, there may be reasons for switching. So always important to review your treatment with your doctor as new things happen. You know, is there a benefit for the new treatment for you? But often things don't switch if everything is okay. But sometimes going to the one pill is an advantage for people.